talk about access control models and methods that we use for access control. So go ahead and go into Socratic and log into Hurdle TSTC. So we're going to talk about, there's a few different methods of, or models, so to speak, of access control. We're going to learn about those, the differences between them. And then we're going to talk a little bit about rights, permissions, and policies. That's what our lab will be about this week as well. So the access control models are just saying, we're going to have a system under which we determine who gets physical access to what. So those physical areas are important. The computer system is important in figuring out who gets access to what. So we've got a few different models of those to talk about. The first one is the discretionary access control. So the owner of the file or folder determines who gets to use it. So let's say user A can log on, they create a folder, they put their stuff in it, they configure permissions so that only they can see it. If user B logs on, they can't see user A's stuff unless user A specifically says that they can, right? So every object has an owner that controls it, and the permissions are assigned by that owner. So the way I always remember that is saying it's at the owner's discretion. It's the owner's discretion in the discretionary access control model. Then we have the mandatory access control model. So that is defining a label to the user and to the objects, and that's kind of like a security clearance level, you could say. So it's a level of trust. Who needs to know that data to be able to complete their job? Is it absolutely necessary for them to have that to do their job? So the way that you remember this one is the labels are the Mac Daddy, right? When it comes to, it's cute and it totally works on a test. And this is very commonly used in government and military applications. So you've heard of clearance, top secret clearance, and the different levels of that. If you watch Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., you definitely know about that. And they're using a mandatory access control model. Then we have the role-based access control. So that is your role in the company determines what privileges you're able to have. So we're used to, in a Windows environment, having an administrator and then having a standard. The standard can only do what the administrator says they can do, and the administrator has root privileges, they can do everything, right? There are some different nuances to that, but that's kind of what we're used to. So in TSTC, we have faculty, we have employees, which are people that work here but don't teach, right? We've got division directors that are over each individual department. We've got an administrative assistant that does all the duties within that department. So they all have different roles. Based on those roles, they need different things to be able to do their job. So that's where the role-based comes in. So someone who doesn't teach doesn't need to have access to the files that a teacher uses to create their presentations or come up with their work. This is an example there. A few practices to think about when we're talking about access control. The implicit deny. So we've talked about the last rule in a firewall. Remember the rules in the firewall? They go down in succession, and the order makes a difference. And at the bottom, there's an implicit deny, which just says, hey, all the things I didn't think about, just deny those two, right? So there's the same kind of thing that we can work with access control when we're assigning users or groups permissions to an object of some sort. Hey, all these people get permission, and then everyone else doesn't, right? We have the everyone group that we can use for that. Least privilege is when you're only given the amount of privileges that you need to perform your job, and that's it. Separation of duties. So that is, a good example of that is if you want to write a check for an organization and there's 2 signature lines on it. So 2 people have to see it and verify that it's legitimate, which is made to keep people from embezzling money, right? Stuff like that. So that's an example of separation of duties. We need more than one person to actually do the task that needs to be done. And then job rotation, that's when you get kind of cycled around your job. The good thing about job rotation is if someone else steps into the duty, they might come in and say, well, I see that you're doing this way, but there's a much better way we can do it. And they can kind of increase their insight a little bit and see a new way of doing something. It reduces boredom. In IT, I don't really think boredom is a big problem for us just because we're problem solvers. And there's always something new going on. Devin, don't you agree?
Yes, but in my job, there is no job rotation.
No,
Because
you're it.
your separation of duties conflicts with your job rotation sometimes.
This is true. This is true. That's a good point. Seeing as how we are problem solvers, you never know what's going to come up. You never know what your day is going to be like. You might have something planned, and then something goes awry, and you have to put your attention elsewhere. So job rotation, if you can do it, if it doesn't conflict, will boost your boredom, enhance your skills. Now you know a little bit more different kinds of things to do. And it might increase security. Why would that increase security? Why would rotating different positions along an IT department increase security?
Not the same problem can go wrong with the same person, I guess, maybe.
Okay.
Or if there's something, if somebody's doing, if there's suspicious activity or something at a certain point, when you rotate the job, you can figure out.
Somebody else might find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point too. Another thing to think about is we stress documentation and stuff in IT and network diagrams and things like that. It doesn't always get done because we're busy. We have a lot of things on our plate. We might be short-staffed. Another reason job rotation is a good idea is what if the person who knows how to do all these things leaves and nobody else knows how to do it and there's no documentation? That's pretty commonplace, really. So when you're not keeping up with your documentation, your ticketing system, anything like that, having job rotation might help out with that. So users, groups, and permissions. I know we've talked about that a lot when we're in your server class. We talk about it in Net Plus. We're always going to talk about it. So once we establish how we want to control our permissions, which model we want to use, then we have to figure out a tangible way to make that work in our environment. So no, doing it account by account on every computer is an administrative nightmare. So normally that's where we have some kind of network operating system that handles those permissions for us. That is kind of the whole point of the network operating system, right? Is to have central management of your users and your permissions and your accounts and passwords and maybe encryption or something, have it in one place. Yeah.
It also goes back to separation of duties.
Yeah.
Because when
Thank
you're
you for
making,
joining my class today, by the way.
if you're making different accounts, let's take the school for example. There's only 2 people that have access to everything on this campus within the Windows, directory system. That'd be Don, the administrator, and Bart.
Really? That's interesting. So they have separated
Well,
that.
The reason Bart has it, if I remember correctly, is because he's got files no one else is supposed to see or have access to.
But if Don bails and he doesn't tell us the administrator password before he leaves,
Well, he's got it documented though, probably somewhere.
maybe, how do we know? I've had lots of companies where, in fact, I had one in particular that I can remember. It's just like a plain old regular middle of the day on a Tuesday, and I had this panicked woman calling saying, I need to fire my IT guy, but he knows everything, and he's the only one that knows anything at all. We have one IT guy, because they were a fairly small business. I don't really know why they had their own IT guy. They used us for a while after that. But he knows everything, he knows every password, no one knows anything, what do I do? So we started walking through, well, here's the things I could change. Here's the things I couldn't. He doesn't really have any documentation. He had some papers in his desk that had it was like a rack in Visio with all the different things that they had, not even what was connected or anything. So there really wasn't anything there at all. So you kind of had to just start over. And I'm not buying physical equipment or anything, but when that person left and they weren't real forthcoming with information. In fact, They fired them, and then they said, if you want my help, it's $150 an hour, now I'm a contractor. Which is something a lot of people will do. So we said, forget you, we'll figure it out. And we got through and figured out how to redo their network. So yeah, it's interesting things can happen. So in our Active Directory, we've got our organizational units, which we'll do a lab on those on Thursday. In this case, we've got human resources, IT, marketing, product dev, sales, software dev. We've got several different OUs, and you can see that the icon looks a little different. That's the only way I can tell you. So we want to create all those different people and then put our users inside of it. And then assign permissions and properties and restrictions based on the organizational unit. Maybe an individual user, like the president, right? They might want some special stuff, but assigning it based on the OU definitely is going to be a lot more helpful. Access control lists are a list of permissions. You can think of a firewall as having an access control list. So this is a firewall, a router on an individual computer. Built into Windows, we have the ability to define access control. The user A can use it, user B can't, that kind of stuff. We've also got some things to help us out with that, NTFS permissions. So the great thing about NTFS is it allows all these different things that we can do with the individual files and folders that are stored on the drive. It's formatted with NTFS. So we can change permissions out there. We can do the same in Linux. So I didn't know this because I don't know a lot of Linux. And by a lot, I mean hardly any. I don't know hardly any Linux. But apparently they do their read, write, and execute. They have a number assigned to it. And when you go to look at a file, that number added together equals all the permissions. So if you had a number that was 6 by a file,
You have everything?
you have, no, if you
Or
have
you have
6,
read, write, and execute.
you have read and write.
Right.
If it was a
7,
7, you would have everything. If it's a 3, you would have execute and write. It's kind of interesting how they did that, and it seems like it's really kind of a quick way to do that.
There'll be 3 sets of numbers. First number will be the owner of the file, and the second number will be user, and the other number is group or something.
Okay, okay, oh, so there's 3 sets, that makes sense. It's not, I mean, the permissions are assigned to different people, there's not just a permission. Yeah, that makes sense. I didn't think about it that way. So when we talk about permissions, again, we want to give them only the absolute amount of access they have to do their job. A lot of times with long-term employees, they've been here 20 years. When they want access to something, we'll just give it to them. And over time, they end up having all the access to everything. So generally, once a year, they'll go through and do a permissions review, say, what all does this person have access to, and do they actually need it? Because when we give people access to things they don't necessarily need, we can get in trouble, they can get themselves in trouble. So we want to avoid that. A new folder is going to inherit permissions from its parent. That's a default. And it makes sense when you think about it, why that would happen. You can uncheck the allow inheritable permissions to disable that. Again, it depends on the individual folder and what you're wanting to do with it. And you can propagate those changes for the subfolders. We don't do it very often, but we're going to do it in the lab just so we can say that we know how to do it. So this is a very key point that I want to make here. The difference between moving and copying. We don't really think much of a difference, but if you copy a folder or a file, it's going to inherit the permissions of the place where you're pasting it to. That can be important. But if you move it, it's going to retain the original permissions. So you kind of have to have a little bit of a thought process behind moving versus copying and which one actually works for you. If you move data within a volume, the data isn't actually moved. The pointer file is just changed. The place that points to where it goes. That's why the permissions don't get moved when you move data. It's not actually moving the data. It's not copying it anywhere else. It's just moving the pointer file. When you double click it, where does this shortcut go to? That helps me remember that. The most common type of authentication by far is a username and password. Why do you think that is?
It's easy.
It's easy and it's cheap, right? It's very easy to set up. So some of the common naming conventions, it might be like first name dot last name, your first initial and then your last name. For a small organization, that's fine. But what do we do when there's more than one John Smith? What's our convention going to be after that? Is it going to be J. Smith 2? Things like that, things to think about. I know when I started here, I thought there's no way there's going to be another A. Hurdle. There's no way. And there's a student in Waco named Amy Lily Hurdle. We have the same, like it's almost exactly the same name. My middle name's Lynn. So they gave me a username with this many numbers behind it, and I'm like, I thought for sure with Hurdle I wouldn't have any competition. But, you know, it happens. So how are our passwords going to be set in this kind of model? Well, the passwords are either going to be set by the admin, and they'll be something like your student ID number, something that you would already know or be able to find, or it might be by the user. So they'll set you up with something, and then the next time you log in, it makes you change it. That's really commonplace. It's really secure. Of course, the problem is now they're going to forget their password, like I did yesterday, and I had to call somebody, and I changed it, and I totally forgot what it was. Then if we're going to establish those passwords, then we can figure out what kind of complexity requirements are there. Now, the funny thing to me about the Server 2008 operating system, I was playing with it a couple days ago, it's password complexity enabled or disabled. It doesn't actually let you make the properties of the complexity. It's just there or it's not. But when you do enable it, you're requiring them to use uppercase, lowercase numbers, letters, numbers, special characters or symbols. 8 to 10 characters or more is what we want. If something is really sensitive, they might require 15 characters. But that's going to be a bugger to remember. Like at that point, you're just kind of combining other passwords together to make a longer one. And passwords should be changed often. Of course, that's something that we can set every 30 days, 60 days, 90 days. It's a good idea to have those set. Although, even to me, that's horribly inconvenient, especially when they don't let me use passwords I've used before, and I end up just making up words, right? Ways that we can protect our user accounts. Rename the password, protect the administrator account. So it's a very good best practice when setting up a network. The name of your administrator is not administrator, just like on a router. We talked about hardening those kinds of devices. We don't want a guest account enabled. Why do we not want a guest account enabled?
Because most guest accounts don't have any type of encryption or anything on
They
them.
don't have anything on them. Well, what could you do if you could get into a guest account? Roll back to our fundamentals of security days. We have the example in the textbook where there was a Trojan horse that was installed, where we talked about transitive trust.
Yeah.
And the Trojan horse was installed in the guest account and then used transitive trust from the operating system to get into the password guarded user account for Bob or Alice or whoever, and they were able to copy over all their files over on the guest account. So we just eliminate that altogether. They could use privilege escalation, and that's essentially what that is. So they're taking a guest account and making it have administrator access. Another thing we can do is use Control-Alt-Delete. So when you log into a workstation, Control-Alt-Delete, then you type in credentials to get in. So the thing about Control-Alt-Delete is that it can't be faked by an application. It has to actually be pressed. So you'll notice that I think in the newer versions of VMware, you can click inside the window and Control-Alt-Delete. You didn't used to be able to do that. So Control-Alt-Delete is kind of it's another safety mechanism that can be used just for that. Another thing that you can do, the computers on here, you have to know the username. You can't just click on a username and try to start faking passwords. You have to actually know what you're getting into, literally. And then some policies we can use, we can enforce password history. That's the thing I hate, where they say, oh, you can't use the last 5 passwords you've used before. Set a minimum and maximum password age. So the maximum is the one that forces you to change the password. The minimum one says No, you have to hold the password for 30 days. Because otherwise, you would just change your password every day until you got it to the one that you liked again. Or if it was disabled altogether, you would just sit and change your password 5 times if your password history was 5.
Yep, I mean.
And then just be back to your original one all over again. So that's the purpose of the max and the min. A minimum password length, 8 characters is probably about the happy point there. But of course, like I said, more secure things might require more. And then just our general complexity requirements that the operating system gives us. Another thing that we do to protect the user account that everybody kind of poo-poos on is user account control. So if something is trying to get administrative access to your PC, it's kind of nice to know about it so it doesn't just run and do whatever it wants. User account control does that for us. Now the problem with it is that entering the password in a whole bunch and having to move over to somebody's machine to do that is pretty inconvenient, and it might tempt us as administrators to just be like, you know what, that person has to install Java like every day. I'm so tired of that. I'll just give them admin rights on that computer and they can just do it. But that is a slippery slope. So that is not something that we want to do. It is also a good idea to, even on your own personal computer, don't use an administrative account all the time. Have a standard user that you log into so that you can see that pop-up come up and know that something is trying to get the computer. Now you have the password to the administrative account too, so you can still type that in and let it, let Java update or Flash or whatever. But I've been surprised sometimes with the things that are trying to do something to my computer that I didn't even know were running. I didn't know that web page was trying to download and execute something. Things like that. I know a lot of that's straightforward, but it's just kind of a nice reminder. Y'all have any questions about anything? I know that y'all are heavy in the server class. So let's go ahead and go to Socratic.